Today we will speak about secondary prevention. As we were discussing, uh, the solutions could be divided into three types of prevention: tertiary, secondary, and primary. Tertiary is the immediate intervention that is necessary for a situation of medical concern. And we discussed incarceration and hospitalization, containment in general for a disease that is long progressed. Secondary prevention, on the other hand, intervenes with persons who are at risk of getting ill, or a public that is at risk of being harmed by a president who lacks the mental capacity to fulfill his function. So when Donald Trump was president, the two intervention methods that repeatedly came up were the 25th Amendment and impeachment. Although less immediately relevant at this time, and certainly not applicable to Joe Biden, now is the time to discuss these interventions to establish for future presidencies, and possibly even for the immediate future presidency. This intervention is not as direct, but its influence is more pervasive as it strengthens the norms and standards of what we require of our leaders. In other words, it doesn't immediately contain the problem, but it sets the standards so that we can intervene. This oft overlooked soft psychological aspect of that is strengthening the norms and standard of society may in fact be the most critical in preventing existentially disastrous, hard results. So even the most storied and revered institutions can crumble with the spread of mental pathology. This is because basic mental capacity is a basic building block for all human affairs. When this foundation is absent or lost, all other rational, logical, or political and legal endeavors may also fail. This is why, in the beginning of the Trump presidency, I stated that if a proper mental health intervention were not allowed, all other interventions would also likely fail. That's the importance of mental capacity. This is what criminal courts recognize when they refuse to allow a defendant lacking in mental capacity to stand trial. They will not be able to proceed with any of the rest unless that capacity is restored. It is also what hospitals consider when they do not proceed with procedures for which a patient lacks the capacity to consent. If they were to refuse a life-saving treatment, a mental capacity evaluation is done to be sure that the person understands the consequences of one's decisions. And if they do not meet the standards of mental capacity, then the entire, the consent, the procedure, the task they purport to perform is annulled because it's not done with the required mental capacity. So this can be extrapolated to a population where when a shared psychosis has affected a population's mental capacity and the ability to proceed in an informed, rational, reality-based manner that considers all consequences, then it becomes a problem. What is the 25th Amendment for, if not designed for this exact reason? Was the question that we already received and tried to answer at a town hall we held immediately following the 2020 presidential election. We urged this intervention when Donald Trump refused to concede his election loss and began behaving bizarrely, such as by withholding critical information for the transition team, firing and replacing top officials responsible for the nation's security, and beginning a federal execution spree. We even contemplated a catastrophic war with Iran. On top of this, he continued to ignore a surging pandemic that was at the time infecting 300,000 and killing 3,000 Americans a day. At the same time as medical systems that he refused to support were collapsing. Every hour of every day that he delayed and disrupted a peaceful transition of power, he was obstructing the critical preparations that were necessary for proper vaccine distribution, for reasons that he did not wish to give his successor any credit for saving lives. And he had already, by then, killed 250,000 Americans, which would reach 500,000 by the time he left office. And I say this because the entire course of a pandemic is determined in the very first days. One can credibly argue that the vast majority of the 1.2 million lives that would be lost could be attributable to Trump's mismanagement of the pandemic in the early days. That's what happens with exponential spread. It also applies to the Trump contagion. If we had intervened early in his presidency or his public influence, we could have very much contained what has now become the shared psychosis of Trump contagion. Indeed, I continue to maintain that the pandemic may have been stopped at the epidemic stage under any other healthy president who would not have ignored the pandemic playbook, who would not have disbanded an entire global health unit and pandemic response team, and who would not have reduced the CDC staff in China to zero. The magnitude and speed of destruction he was inflicting on the nation was incomparable, despite the greatest concentration of top medical experts, the greatest wealth, and the most powerful military in the world at our disposal. While it was not our place to opine on whether or not the 25th Amendment is the appropriate response, this is not our area of expertise, we as mental health experts could and should say if a president needed to be removed for public health and safety reasons, whatever the means. This was because, especially in a hyper-partisan environment, an apolitical voice based on data, science, and medical neutrality was quintessentially important, especially at a time when the very extinction of our species could be at stake, and this certainly exceeds political partisanship. Not to mention mental health experts' primary duty to protect public health and safety, as outlined by the American Psychiatric Association's ethics code itself, its promotion of its Goldwater rule being more important notwithstanding. The very preamble states that our primary responsibility is to society and our patients, not to a public figure. And the Declaration of Geneva, which makes humanitarian goals our primary responsibility, not obedience to a destructive government. That was the conclusion after the Nuremberg trials, from which the Declaration of Geneva came. So according to legal scholars, this was actually the proper and intended approach for the 25th Amendment. In fact, its very author, former Fordham Law School Dean John Feerick, stated unequivocally that the intention of the 25th Amendment was that the data would drive the process, and medical professionals are a source of data. Fordham Law School professor John Rogan, his close collaborator on this issue, clarified on another occasion that physicians have a supererogatory obligation to share specialized knowledge. This is especially important when discussing psychiatric conditions, which may be hard to apprehend. The vice president, instead of being the driver of the process, would agree when leaned upon by the cabinet or the other body that Congress appoints to supplant the cabinet, compelled by the data. So this removes the conflicts of interest that many have been concerned about. So instead of the vice president coming first, he's supposed to come last, according to the drafters of the amendment. Constitutional scholar and Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland had recently reintroduced at that time legislation for a commission to oversee presidential capacity, of which physicians and psychiatrists would comprise half. Attorney and Professor Richard Painter, former chief White House ethics counsel for the Bush-Cheney administration and former chair of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, upon confirming that the 25th Amendment needed to be used with an other body to replace the cabinet, stated to us that the Goldwater Rule is a violation of your First Amendment rights and a violation of your duty to your country and to human civilization. That was his statement, his declaration at our 2019 conference at the National Press Club with 13 of the nation's foremost experts of all different fields gathering to discuss the importance of mental fitness in leadership. Their legal assertions aligned with our understanding of medical ethics and the therapeutic conscience every step of the way. Politicians must do their part, they were stating, as must mental health professionals. Political bodies should consult with mental health experts, the purpose for which we even set up an independent expert panel. The public was a stakeholder, not to mention the president's employer, now at the receiving end of unacceptable levels of abuse and potential imminent victimization. We were in a situation where the president's dangerousness had already unfolded in overwhelming demonstrations of actual danger, such as it was no longer whether he was dangerous, but how much was he dangerous. The key point is that the public has this constitutional provision at their disposal. It is for them, and they have designated government officials to implement it at the appropriate time. And this counts not just for the 25th Amendment, but for impeachment, which prior to the 25th Amendment, which was instituted in the 1960s, there was impeachment for high crimes and misdemeanors, including misdemeanors of mental impairment. And the fact that either of these failed to be implemented during the Trump presidency has to do with the curtailment of these rights of the people, be they lack of education or circumvention of process, such as the disinformation that these processes had nothing to do with medical input. In fact, medical input would have been the primary driver for either of these processes in any other situation where the original intent of either interventions were followed. So all this is argument to strengthen the 25th Amendment and impeachment, not to so that this doesn't happen again, rather than to suppress these interventions as not being effective or not working. Section 4 of the amendment, the 25th Amendment, is especially difficult when the inability results from mental pathology and accompanies denial or worse, sociopathy and deception of the public. Just as denial makes serious conditions harder to treat, the sicker people are, the further they run from doctors and hospitals. Denial makes it harder to apply the 25th Amendment, especially where it's needed. And these are actually the most relevant places where it should be applied, where there is greatest resistance on the part of the president. So nevertheless, these are the conditions under which we find ourselves, and therefore argues for even greater mental health education, not less. As a drafter of the amendment, Mr. Feerick repeatedly emphasized the guidance should come from the medical data and not from the cabinet alone or the Congress's other body alone, but data. So this is where the role of mental health experts is crucial and needs to be strengthened, not weakened. And our role in educating the public is more important than ever. The people are empowered for self-government only when they are able to make autonomous choices with access to correct facts, the best available knowledge, and can lean on their chosen representatives to make the right decisions. Whereas impeachment is also said to be a mechanism for removing a misbehaving president, the 25th Amendment is critical and appropriate as a means of swift removal according to medical necessity. So all the difficulties of Donald Trump's presidency might have been avoided with the simple requirement of fitness for duty evaluation before candidacy, or at least before assuming office, but no one has really touched upon this topic. Yet it would seem more than reasonable. All American military personnel must first pass a fitness for duty exam even before they serve. Further, those who handle nuclear weapons undergo especially rigorous psychological testing that needs to be renewed every year. It's rather glaring omission that the one who commands those weapons or leads the most powerful military on the planet are the only ones not required to undergo any testing. This is incompatible with the safe survival of the human species in our day and many other species, if we consider that the president single-handedly handles technology that is enough to destroy the planet 7 times over. Not only that, it's illogical. What is little known is that fitness or capacity is required of every task and every job in the United States. Everyone, regardless of whether one must pass an examination beforehand or not, are required to have this to be able to maintain their positions. Of course, fitness is presumed until signs of unfitness appear in many tasks, at which time the employer or the court may remove the employee or halt a trial until one undergoes testing. In the case of a will, the contents will not be honored if the person signing it has been shown to be unfit. Mental health experts perform these fitness exams all over the country all the time. Fitness for duty tests are usually simple to perform, standardized, and possible to tailor to any task or job. And since it's a functional test, complicated diagnostic procedures are not necessary. And so we don't have to truly be concerned about confidentiality other than whether or not the person is fit or unfit. But that's not confidential information to begin with, because the evaluation is done for the public or the court that is open to the public. Extraordinarily, elected officials, however, are the only ones exempt from needing to be fit for the offices they hold. This irrational exception cannot be the intent of the framers of the nation and the Constitution. And if the highest offices of the land are indeed being filled with persons who are unfit to hold any job anywhere else, then it's an urgent right of the people to demand a sensible amendment. Indeed, when abundant, high-quality, relevant information became available through the special counsel Robert Mueller's report in 2019, an independent, non-governmental panel of top mental health experts from around the country came together to form a panel and to perform a standard mental capacity evaluation on the president at the time as a public service in response to their bombarding us on the World Mental Health Coalition's website with just a demand for some kind of response from mental health experts, not knowing that we were actually blacked out of the major media. Reports on the president's performance at work by close associates and coworkers are the most important data for fitness evaluation, not a personal interview in which a person can lie, misrepresent, and in fact, deceive and manipulate in cases of dangerous personalities. So we have all this information under sworn testimony, the best and the highest quality we could have ever asked for a fitness evaluation. In fact, it was, for most of us, it was our dream evaluation. Never have we been given such valuable information in abundance. And based on that information, we assessed that indeed Donald Trump was unfit. He failed every criterion of mental fitness. This meant that he lacked the ability to take in information and advice. He had lacked the ability to process that information without becoming fixated or drawn into conspiracy theories. He could not consider realistic consequences before making decisions, and he could not be stable in his decision-making without making impulsive reversals. Also, being dangerous made him automatically unfit, even if he met all the above criteria that we examined. So therefore, we had as a president a man who was not only unfit to be president, but unfit for just about any job in the country. Scientific polymath and co-author of the second edition of The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, Ian Hughes, indicated in his book, Disordered Minds, How Dangerous Personalities Are Destroying Democracy, that the small fraction of personality disordered leaders are responsible for almost all global atrocities. The detriment is likely to be even greater if we consider the contagion they induce through a change of culture, and the similar personalities they encourage and amplify, as well as the spread of shared psychosis, which makes an entire population vulnerable to their abuses and into becoming their instruments. All this is a predictable and preventable phenomenon. And we would prevent innumerable horrors and tragedies if we only instituted a screen for the very positions to which dangerous personalities are drawn. Already, corporate boardrooms now corporate boards require chief executive officers to take fitness evaluations before they assume their positions. So by keeping the standards and setting limits, we are also offering proper assistance to those disordered minds. Firm boundaries are the beginning of better grounding in reality and learning to cope so that their symptoms do not transmogrify into grotesque delusions of grandeur and psychotic fantasies of impunity. Letting symptoms loose in such a way only triggers catastrophic disillusionment and rage reactions in the end, since they are not based in reality. And reality, no matter how it tries to meet their expectations, can never do so. And now, with nuclear arsenals being modernized and 7 more countries owning nuclear weapons than during the Cold War era, the very perpetuation of our civilization depends on our ability to be sober about the critical need to ensure that we have mentally fit leaders. As Amy Jacobson, in her compelling new book, nuclear war a scenario has made chillingly clear that someone such as Donald Trump, who meets criteria for both the 25th Amendment and impeachment and is unfit for any job, should not be a candidate for the presidency, should have been obvious. The fact that he's running at all reveals the extent to which we, as a nation, are people serving the leader instead of the leader as a public servant serving the people. The entire purpose of the US Constitution was to prevent exactly this scenario of falling under a tyrant. The assumption that those with such severe symptoms and such brazen criminality as Donald Trump would not reach the presidency no longer holds. It already happened. We must now, therefore, recognize that his ascendancy and endurance are actually a barometer of how we as a people are being deprived of our own rights to choose a mentally and morally fit leader who should serve us instead of himself. But now that we know this, what will we do about it? Strengthening all the provisions reviewed today, such as the 25th Amendment, impeachment, and ways of assessing fitness before a presidential candidate reaches the presidency, should be mandatory, because civilization may not last much longer without it. We may have been hoodwinked into the first Trump presidency, which brought us chaos, disinformation, oppression, and even a massacre. Should there be a second? This so-called choice, because in my view it's not a rational choice, may cost us our nation and all humankind. We must therefore choose to reinforce our norms and standards. It's not an ad hominem attack on Donald Trump, not a comment on his followers, but objective standards and norms that we can decide in advance to implement to help our own empowerment and to strengthen the foundation of our collective mental health so that we can proceed with all the rest of business, including electoral politics.